Hey you, this is going to be a quick video today. I really just want to talk about my favorite sci-fi novel and what makes it so awesome. Because this book, Hyperion, if you haven't read the video title, gets put in a lot of great sci-fi book lists along with books like Dune, Foundation, I, Robot, but it's really nothing like any of those books. It sits somewhere between literary, fantasy, and sci-fi and horror. It's a completely different kind of book, and if you've been considering reading it, I want to tell you why you should and why it's so awesome, especially for people, all five of you, who read a lot of classics, literary fiction, and stuff outside of sci-fi, and you find sci-fi to be a little bit dry in the prose, a little bit shallow in the characters. This book is completely different than basically every other sci-fi novel I've ever read, and so much so that after reading it, I had kind of a hole in my heart, a Hyperion-sized hole in my heart, because no other genre fiction book does what this book does. I mean, none of them really even attempt to do it. This is why Hyperion is so awesome. Hyperion is basically a tour through the sci-fi genre. It's showing you science fiction through a bunch of different lenses and through the eyes of a bunch of different kinds of characters. So basically, you have a frame story that's based off the English poet Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where there's a group of pilgrims going to a strange backwater planet, and on their way there they have all this time, and so they end up telling each other the stories of why they've ended up on this pilgrimage to meet the Shrike. And the Shrike is this very strange, mysterious creature that they're going to meet at the pilgrimage spot, supposedly. So these characters are very different, and they've all come on the pilgrimage for completely different reasons. And basically, we go one by one through all of their stories told in different forms with different styles and learn about how they came to be on the pilgrimage. Now, pretty much all the stories can actually be neatly described as genre mashups, usually between two genres, but all with a bit of space opera and horror mixed in there. On top of that, the prose in Hyperion is fantastic. At one point, Dan Simmons, the author, describes the zooplankton around a character floating in the ocean as looking like motes of dust floating around an abandoned ballroom. No more stalling. The first story. We get an epistolary novel written by a Catholic priest, basically his journal entries as he sets out upon this journey across a jungle into this valley where these strange, mysterious creatures live that are vaguely humanoid and that have a strange religion, and they travel to these strange Lovecraftian sites. The whole story is very Lovecraftian. You get that in the epistolary form where the tension is building through these journal entries as this character slowly unfolds more and more of the mystery, and it's very disturbing, and honestly it might be a little off-putting to some readers because it's by far the most weird, creepy, disturbing story out of all of them in this book. Second, completely different, a military sci-fi story mashed up with a vaguely erotica flavored romance novel where this female character is meeting up with our protagonist, who's like a decorated military commander on all these different battlefields, and he ends up fighting these crazy military sci-fi set piece fights, floating through space, stealing spaceships. It's pretty awesome, but it also has this strange feeling of dread that laces all the way through it, where you don't know who this female character is or why she's visiting our protagonist. But at the same time, it's also something that any military sci-fi fan will enjoy. Now, the third story is the life of a writer and his struggle to compose this amazing best-selling poem. So we get him working in these horrible mines and posing his poem on ragged sheets of paper in his hut, and then slowly finishing the book and then selling it, and then he becomes a hack writing all these sequels. It's a very writerly story about the pain of creation and how you can sell out and then get your muse back. It's really about the muse, but of course the muse concept ties into the cosmic horror from the first story and from the Hyperion Cantos in general. Now, our next is from a character named Sol Weintraub, who is telling us a sort of campus academia story mashed up with Cyclit. He's a professor on basically a Midwestern college planet. He literally describes the, brick and ivy school surrounded by cornfields that go on for thousands of kilometers. And it's mixed in with a bit of sicklet because his daughter, through her work, ends up getting a very strange condition, an entropic condition. And it's really about the family dealing with her condition, and then Sol Weintraub, the main character, trying to find a cure, and the whole family dealing with the fallout of her condition. But again, it's sicklet and campus novel, but it's still cosmic horror. And you'll see why. One side note thing is, Dan Simmons, the writer here, is at his best describing really weird stuff. I find that the scenes of just a father and a daughter talking, for me, were the least enjoyable in the book. When he's writing scenes between characters that are barely human, in states of mind that are completely beyond anything that we can imagine, that's when he's at his best and most believable. Not to say it's bad, I still enjoyed this story a lot. The next one, the story of Braun Lamia. So this is a hard-boiled detective cyberpunk heist story. All of that. Where there's a bit of a subversion on the trope with the hard-boiled detective being a woman and the clueless client being a man. Now in this story, there's not only a lot of fun sort of detective work, but there's also some Neuromancer style, like epic cyberpunk moments where they're traveling through this cyberspace and structures of information, and there's a hacker character that they have to hook up with and who helps them pull off this cyber heist. There's also a bit of romance thrown in, which I've noticed more on my reread than when I first read it, is Dan Simmons does like to write romantic tension between his characters. So that's going to come up a lot more than in your standard sci-fi novel. This story kind of ends up being the most important going into the sequel. So pay attention to it. Now the next one is the story of the character who we're following in the frame story. So we start with this character, the consul, who's kind of an older, grizzled, traveling diplomat bureaucrat. This is his story, and apparently it was one of like 2 stories that Dan Simmons wrote well before the writing of this book that helped inspire this whole Hyperion Cantos. Now this one is again romance, but it's time travel romance mixed in with like environmentalist allegorical novel about the destruction of ecosystems and planets and how our connection to the animals works, which is absolutely one of the highlights of the book. Is he writes conversations with dolphins, and the way he depicts the dolphins having fully realized personalities that are fundamentally different from human personalities, and same with like their communication system, is just amazing. Like, it's always stuck with me. I don't think I've seen anyone write human animal communication so believably, just in such a, I almost want to say, respectful way. Like, I think he's giving animals the credit they deserve. He's not writing them as just like machines that just sort of do stuff and are cute. And he's also not writing them as anthropomorphized humans trapped in weird bodies. He's writing them as intelligent animals. And once that I read this, I realized how animals had kind of been getting the short shrift in a lot of other fiction, because here they feel so real. Now, the time traveling romance aspect is just heart-wrenching. And I think on my initial read, this story, which is the final one, had the biggest impact for me and made me realize just how much I enjoyed this book. Because you read that first story and then the second and the third, and you're like, is he just going to keep like hitting home runs like this, like one after another? And then when the last story is probably the most emotionally moving, and I start to then have faith that this book is actually going to stick the landing, and it's not just showing off with all these different stories and genres. It's actually going to make something out of this. And then it ends. And the ending of this book is one of the worst cliffhangers ever. Now, it's not really the writer's fault, because the volumes of Hyperion were split by the publisher. It really is just one book. So I'd suggest, if you're getting this book, just get the second and have it waiting when you finish the first. Because I had to like order it and wait a few days, and honestly, it was a rough few days. It ends in the worst possible moment if you don't have the rest of the story to read. Which is not to say it's really a bad ending. It's really just not an ending. At that point, you realize that all of this stuff, this whole frame story and all of these individual pilgrim stories, this is really just the part one of this much larger saga. And what I will say about the second book, because I don't want to go into analyzing it, is it has a much more standard structure. You're really just following a couple characters on their adventures, you might say. But did not come as a disappointment because the real question that I think any person would have about the second book is, does it manage to catch all the footballs and mysteries and loose ends that this first book threw up? Because this book is kind of just hitting you with mystery after mystery, question after question. And it continues to go on like that, like through a lot of the second book. So, I will say, Hyperion, in the end, does the ending of Hyperion satisfy? Does Dan Simmons manage to answer all the questions? Does he give a satisfying ending to all these stories? Well, honestly, I'd say he does. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. I hope you end up picking up Hyperion 1 and 2 and reading them and enjoying them. I have not read the other books in the series yet, so let me know in the comments if you've read them or if there are other sci-fi books that you think sound like this one and might, appeal to people who like a more weird structure and a little bit more experimentation in their genre fiction. All right. See you guys. Have a good one. Drive safe.